jam-packed team, and this week started off really nice. We had the cool temperatures this morning. We had a good bit of sunshine during the day. It was a little breezy, and we'll continue to see those breezes overnight tonight and into tomorrow morning. But then through the day tomorrow, those breezes are going to calm down just a little bit more. And even though we started off with a good bit of sunshine early on, we've been dealing with a few pesky clouds here that have been streaming over the metro area at times. Just earlier today, kind of blocking out the sun at times, and at times it was thin enough that the sun was still able to filter through, but not really a complete overcast. We do have, though, some of these thicker clouds in spots. Now you can see here on the north side, there are a lot of holes in those clouds where you can still see the moon and the stars out there for tonight. But then through Atlanta here and on the south side, especially south and west of the city, these clouds are just a little bit thicker, blocking out more of the moon and the stars out there. And we do have a pretty good coverage of clouds here, but these are a little bit thinner over on the east side. The important thing about these clouds, though, is even though they're out there and there's some moisture in association with them, these are not the rain-producing type clouds. We're not seeing any rain coming in here with these clouds at all. In fact, I'll widen out a little bit more, and you can see really over a big part of the southeast, we're not dealing with any rain here from New Orleans back toward Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, up into Tennessee. We're rain free. But where we do see some rain is down into parts of Florida where there is a little more moisture there. Nothing really out of the ordinary going on down in Florida. It's not like there's a tropical system or anything, but the front that came through our area to dry us out is now stalled out. So we have the drier air to the north here, but it did not sweep through Florida to clean out their air. So they're still dealing with a lot of the humidity and a lot of the moisture around, but nothing really major moving through their area. Let me take you back over here, though, to the Midwest here, back into parts of Texas and Oklahoma. Check this out. We have some tornado warnings here in the northern part of Texas and right here in that little panhandle area of Oklahoma as well, with this cluster of storms moving through there. Numerous severe thunderstorm warnings, but a couple of tornado warnings there too, going on in here in September. So we're not expecting anything like that to move into our area. We are just going to enjoy this big high pressure system that's sitting on top of us, that is sinking air, that is calm air, and for now it is cool air, but that cooler air is going to be replaced by some warmer air. So just as you think it's time to get used to this cooler snap moving in here, it's only going to be for a few days before we start warming back up. We're talking about our high temperatures eventually going back into the upper 80s to near 90 degrees. As of right now, we don't have any 90s here on our 7-day outlook, but it is possible. We're going to be close. We've got a couple of days on there with some 89s that are going to be pushing into our area. Here's a live look outside right now, and this is a beautiful view there over the city of Atlanta, looking over Bobby Dodd Stadium there at Georgia Tech, and of course you can see our skyline there. Now I know it's dark, so it's hard to see, but you can see here in the dark sky, there are just a few of those clouds around, but again, it's not a complete overcast that we're dealing with at this hour here in the Atlanta area. Here's a view right now looking over Truist Park where the Braves are playing. Their Cubs are in town tonight. Kind of a sparse crowd there in this stadium, but at least the weather is cooperating. It is a nice night for baseball as temperatures are cooling off, and it's not like one of those really humid nights at Truist Park either. So a nice, comfortable evening there. And then here's our view from Arizona Avenue there in DeKalb County looking westward toward the city. And this kind of gives you another view of the clouds that we have. Again, not that overcast, just a few of those clouds around, some blue sky. And it's a really nice night with those comfortable temperatures, and the low humidity is the key of it feeling so nice and refreshing out there. Take a look at the Almanac for today. We got up to 81 degrees. Now, the average high for this time of year, remember for a while in the summer, the average high was 90. Then we saw the average high drop to 89, then to 88, then 87. Well, now the average high for this time of year is 86. So that's where we, on average, would be here on a September 8th. And we were below average once again today. 81 degrees was our high temperature this afternoon, about 5 degrees below the average. And our low this morning was 66. That's 2 degrees below the average. In the mornings, we should be around 68 here for this time of year. We haven't had any rain here in our area today, and we're still watching that rainfall deficit grow. It's a little more than 1.5 inches below where we should be in rainfall, even though we did have some rain in spots over the weekend. We just didn't add a lot to the official rain gauge down at Hartsfield-Jackson, so we still are dealing with that rainfall deficit. We could use some rain to help us out, to bring those numbers up a little bit more. However, we're not going to see that this week. It is going to be a dry week ahead. So after getting up to 81 for a high temperature today, we're now back into the 70s. Look at this, lower 70s even, 72 degrees in Atlanta, lower 70s in Peachtree City, mid 70s in LaGrange. But if you think that's cool, look at this. Lawrenceville is 68. Athens is 63, Gainesville 69. And that's thanks to that easterly flow that's pushing into our area today. Often, we would call this a wedge, and a lot of times when we have a classic wedge, that brings us more clouds and it brings us overrunning moisture with mist and drizzle. But this is a dry easterly flow. It's not tapping into any Atlantic moisture, and we don't have any southwesterly moist air riding up and over that. So it's a dry wedge that we have, but we're still feeling the impacts of that easterly flow with these temperatures. That's why it's so much cooler in Athens now at 63, and we even have more of those 60s even into Canton. Gainesville, we mentioned, was 69, but then warmer in Rome and Dalton, where we're at 76 degrees right now in the Rome area. Now, when you get up tomorrow morning, it's going to be another one of those cool, refreshing mornings. There may be a few clouds around to start, but we'll be at about 62 degrees here in the Atlanta area. Then get up to 64 around 9 o'clock. Still at lunchtime, we're going to be in the mid 70s and then topping off around 81 in the afternoon, which is where we were today. So tomorrow afternoon, it's going to feel very similar to what we had out there for today. And again, in the afternoon, maybe a couple of clouds mixing in at times, but it is going to be a day with plenty of sunshine, plenty of dry air, but just a few of those clouds that'll be here every now and then. Here's what we're watching right now. We've got a few of those clouds over us at this hour, and you can see this easterly flow right here, this northeasterly flow. That's what we're talking about, that's helping to bring us in some of that cooler air with that, kind of wedge effect there with that cooler air that's moving in from the north and east. But as I mentioned, it's not tapping into any of that Atlantic moisture. So we are dry out there right now. We will be dry through the evening hours. Tomorrow morning, again, still that northeasterly flow, a few of those clouds here and there to start mixing in with the sunshine. Lunchtime, mostly sunny skies into the afternoon, mostly sunny to partly cloudy. You see that the winds start to shift just a little bit going into Wednesday. It's still going to be a cool start, but into the afternoon, we're going to start seeing those temperatures creeping up a little bit. See, it's more of a northerly flow and less of a northeasterly flow. Still dry out there, but we start to come back up to the mid 80s, and then we're talking about upper 80s once we get toward the end of the week. But still, dry weather conditions. We don't expect any rain here through midweek, also at the end of the week, and even persisting into the weekend. We don't expect any rain to move into our area. And the thing that makes it feel so good and so nice is the dry air in place. This is our moisture map, and that shows the blues and the purple colors that you see here over North Georgia. That's where we have some really dry air over our area. And once you get down into South Georgia, especially into Florida, that's where we see a lot more of that moisture. And it's down in Florida where I just showed you that rain on radar. So the front came through, stalled out down to the south. So we are enjoying the dry air on the north side of the front, but on the south side of that front, it is still hot and muggy, and they're still dealing with some showers there. But we have the dry air not only over us now, but look at this, into tomorrow. It is going to be dry. That also persists into Wednesday with dry weather. Thursday, dry weather. Now notice the dark blues start lightening up just a little bit. Not enough to give us any rain, but we may see the humidity levels trying to creep up a little bit going into Friday and into the weekend, but still no rain. We are going to be dry for an extended period here, at least through the weekend. And then the humidity levels coming back up a little bit going into Monday, but still, we don't think that that will even be enough to give us any rain chances. So here's a look at the dew points. This is the actual measure of how much moisture is into the atmosphere. The dew point is the temperature that the air would have to drop to in order for the air to become saturated, all right? So when you see dew points in the 70s, that is when it is oppressive humidity. In the 60s, it's just kind of humid. Dew points in the 50s, though, is really comfortable. And that's what we have, not only today, but we're going to hold on to those dew points that are going to be in the 50s with that dry air that's going to stick with us really for the rest of the week. And what does that mean for rain chances? This. You don't see anything on here, do you? Yeah, that's because we don't have any rain chances in our area. Normally this map would be showing you a green bar that would come up to either 20, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100%. But we aren't seeing that here because we don't expect any rain for the end of the week and into the weekend. And this is our model comparison, also showing a bunch of zeros here for the next 7 days. Now, this is trying to kick up a little bit of green up in parts of northeast Georgia. That could be a few raindrops here and there toward the end of the period going into the beginning of next week. But right now we don't expect really anything measurable. Now the other thing with this dry air and the front that has moved through, we are seeing the below average temperatures. You're really going to be noticing it more in the mornings because it's not only going to be cool, it's going to be refreshing. In the morning we're thinking about 62 for a low, then 61 Wednesday and Thursday. 63 Friday, back up to 65 Saturday. Those morning temperatures get a little milder once the dew points start coming back up a little bit too. And the afternoon temperatures will start warming a bit too. 81 for a high Tuesday, 85 Wednesday, 88 Thursday, near 90 on Friday before going back to 86 degrees here for your Saturday. Hey, I want to show you what's going on. Nothing is happening right now in the tropical Atlantic, and we really don't expect any development over the next 7 days. Now, of course, at this time of year, anything can kick up, but we're not really expecting anything as of right now. But of course, we'll keep an eye on it every day. But a lot of folks have been asking me about Kiko. This is a hurricane that is in the Pacific, and this is Hawaii right here. So you can see Kiko is to the north of Hawaii. We don't expect it to be a direct hit on the islands. However, it's skirting, well, it didn't go to my, oh, yeah, I think it's going to take us here. Nope. So again, this is showing us no tropical cyclones expected in the next 7 days. But I did make a map. You know what? Let me come back over here, and I want to put that on for you so you can see this map that I was talking about here with the Pacific hurricane. And here we go right here. I'll put this on so y'all can see it here. The Pacific hurricane track. It will show up here in just a moment. It's got to kind of load here. There we go. So this is Kiko. This is that hurricane, and I just showed you the satellite imagery, and it was showing that storm north and east of the islands. So you can see it's a Cat 1 at 85 miles an hour moving northwest at 15, but it's expected to become a tropical storm, still with 60 mile an hour winds here Tuesday, Wednesday 50 mile an hour winds, and then weakening as it moves up toward the north and east. So even though it's not a direct hit on the islands here for Hawaii, it's going to be close enough and strong enough that they are going to have some rough surf, especially on the northern coasts of these islands as the system passes on by them. So again, not a direct hit on Hawaii. It will be weakening. It's not expected to be a hurricane north of them, but still a tropical storm strong enough to send all of the islands there in Hawaii some rough surf. So that's going to be the main impacts that they're going to be feeling there. Now, notice again on the European model, all that more to the south into parts of Florida, and we've got the dry air here, and that is really going to be the pattern going through this week ahead. Through Wednesday, we're dry here. We have the rain down to the south. Thursday, dry. Friday, dry. It does try to dry out a little bit more in parts of Florida here as everything pushes to the south, but we're going to hold on to the dry weather even through the weekend and into the beginning of next week too. So the 7-day forecast isn't really that exciting. Well, it's exciting, but it's just not showing a lot of different weather here. In fact, if you'll look at the 7-day, there's something missing there, right? Raindrops. Yeah, we don't have any raindrops on that 7-day outlook. And notice the cool air to start here, Tuesday, low of 62, high of 81. The mornings remain cool on Wednesday and Thursday, and even on Friday, we're talking 61 to 63 degrees for those lows here for this week, those mornings. But the afternoons, that's when it's going to start warming up. 85 Wednesday, 88 Thursday, 89 Friday. Then heading into Saturday, still comfortable mornings. Mid and some upper 80s for Saturday and Sunday, and then back up to 89 degrees here for Monday. So enjoy the dry pattern, cool mornings, but those afternoons do start warming up here just a little bit more. Thank you for watching this extended weather update here on 11 Alive Plus. and on Weather Impact 24/7. If you're watching us on YouTube right now, be sure and download 11 Alive Plus on your TV. You'll not only get information like this, these extended weather updates, but also a lot of other weather content and a look at radar anytime. So be sure to download 11 Alive Plus on your TV. We hope you have a great night. Thank you for watching us. We'll have more updates. Have another one tonight at 11 on 11 Alive News here on 11 Alive Plus, as well as more updates throughout the day tomorrow. Have a great night.